In April of 1992, a young man from a well-to-do East Coast family hitchhiked to Alaska and walked into the wilderness north of Mount McKinley. 4 months later, his decomposed body was found by a party of moose hunters. Shortly after the discovery of the corpse, I was asked by the editor of Outside Magazine to report on the puzzling circumstances of the boy's death. His name turned out to be Christopher Johnson McCandless. He'd grown up, I learned, in an affluent suburb of Washington, D.C., where he'd excelled academically and been an elite athlete. Immediately after graduating, with honors, from Emory University in the summer of 1990, McCandless dropped out of sight. He changed his name, gave the entire balance of a $24,000 savings account to charity, abandoned his car and most of his possessions, burned all the cash in his wallet, and then he invented a new life for himself, taking up residence at the ragged margin of our society, wandering across North America in search of raw, transcendent experience. His family had no idea where he was or what had become of him until his remains turned up in Alaska. Why did he do this? Why would a 24-year-old man, with his whole life ahead of him, desert his family and promising future for the sake of trekking into a land of peril, adversity, and conditions modern man could not survive without today's technology? In this documentary, I attempt to piece together what drove Chris McCandless to pursue this peregrination around the United States and into the wild. While Chris and his parents were far apart, his relationship with his sister, Corinne, was much closer. Like Chris, she clashed fiercely with Walt and Billy. Unlike Chris, she made peace with them soon after Chris disappeared.
Have you ever thought about doing the same thing Chris did?
No, I never really thought about doing an adventure like Chris's. I was not really into the outdoors as much as Chris, and doing a trip like Chris has never crossed my mind.
What was it about your brother that made you two so close?
We grew up together, and both our parents were always working as they had their own business together. And so Chris and I kind of grew close because we were always together when our parents were at work.
What was your reaction to your brother's sudden decision to leave?
Very surprised because he never really gave any hints on when he was leaving or what he was going to do. And so it was really sudden, and it was really surprising that he never told anybody and never connected with the family when he was on his trip.
Did you ever worry about your brother? To what extent did you believe him? Why did you believe him?
I never really doubted Chris. I knew that Chris would hopefully prepare for the trip, and he was always well educated in what he was doing, and so I never really doubted his skills.
The roots of his ambitions begin with his family. Walt and Billy McCandless started out their lives from humble roots, growing up with families that were not very wealthy. Through hard work and the business they ran together, they were able to grow and accumulate wealth, securing a promising future for their children. Yet, the family dynamic in the McCandless household was very hostile, demanding, and secretive, potentially driving Chris to leave it all behind for a more optimistic future. What about his childhood helped you predict that Chris would leave?
When Chris was younger, he always used to be hanging by himself, doing games by himself. He could always be alone, but never lonely.
What would you have changed about his childhood if you had a second chance?
When Chris was younger, it seemed like I tried to push his future and kind of lay out his future, and so I wish I gave him more freedom to make his own decisions.
And I think as a mother, I would have liked to spend more time with my son. Definitely spend a lot of time in the office with Walt. Kind of had a distant relationship with my second child.
Is there anything you would have liked Chris to know?
When Chris found out about my relationship with my ex-wife, the way he found out kind of ruined our relationship. So what I wish I would have done is kind of talk to him and given myself a chance to explain to him, kind of rebuild our relationship.
What do you suspect Chris's opinion of you was?
I think Chris thought that we were trying to lay out his future, and we were trying to pick his decisions for his future career by making him go to college and try to have him work for our business. And he really thought that college was not really right for him, and he was just gonna stop education after high school and do his own thing.
Yeah, we really just wanted what was best for our son. I think we pushed him a little too hard and forced him in our direction, and he just disagreed with it. I think we butted heads for a little too long, and that might have been the reason for him leaving.
Do you respect your son's decisions?
No, after college, Chris kind of went off and did his own thing. He never really told what he was going to do and his plans. So it kind of felt that we were like kind of just side things and he didn't really care about us.
Yeah, we would have liked to know what had happened to our son before it was too late.
Being Chris's mom, do you think there are any holes in your relationship as a second mother?
As a second mother, I definitely felt like there was time that I needed to make up for with Chris and his sister Corrine. But I think I spent a little too much time in the office working while kind of focusing on my own business plan, raising the kids. So I think my dedication to my job kind of was the split between us.
Ronald Franz is a benevolent 80-year-old man who Chris met along his travels in the Anza Borrego State Park. Chris had a huge impact on this man's life after he left, so much that Ron asked if Chris would be his grandson. Through this interview, we'll see just how much Chris affected those around him and get some insight on some of his philosophies.
So memorable about Chris is the way he made his decisions freely and the way he lived his life, the nomadic lifestyle, and that's what really inspired me, is the fact that there was no deterring him. He had a very natural sense of nature and the way he made his decisions for himself and not based off the opinions of others. That's what really inspired me. What I would say to Chris is thank you for opening my eyes to the natural creations that way to be explored and being the person to make and start the initiation and change in my life. What Chris said that stuck with me over the years is how I don't need people in my life to be happy, and how it doesn't make sense for me to sit around expecting my life to change, and if I wanted any change in my life, that I needed to.
A transcendentalist is a person who believes that a higher state of mind can be achieved by living in nature and disconnecting oneself from modern society.
A transcendentalist has three main values: idealism, individualism, and the divinity of nature. Chris consistently displays all three of these traits. Could he have disappeared in order to become a transcendentalist? Next, I'll interview Ralph Waldo Emerson, a popular figure in the transcendentalist movement.
What is transcendentalism?
The idea that what is sensed or what is intuitive is by far the most important way to experience anything, as opposed to what is thought, such as scientific knowledge.
What defines a transcendentalist?
A transcendentalist is somebody who goes out into nature and abandons all their worldly possessions and ties in favor of communing with nature, thus achieving a higher level of awareness and understanding in life.
Do you believe Chris was a true transcendentalist?
Yes, because while he did die, before he died, he achieved a higher level of being, and he achieved true happiness. As you can see in one of the last photos taken before his death, he's standing there quite happily holding a sign saying that he's lived a good life, so he's clearly happy and content with his life. So he achieved this happiness. He is most definitely a transcendentalist.
One of the main reasons I'm so driven to complete this documentary is because Chris and I share so many similarities. In my youth, I'm told I was self-absorbed, willful, reckless, and moody. I disappointed my father in the usual ways. He wanted me to go to Harvard for med school, but I didn't want to do that. This caused a lot of fighting between us, and in my later high school years, our family was completely divided. Yet, I persisted through it. I had other goals, like exploring the natural beauties of the world. When I was young, around Chris's age, I had my own journey considered by many to be suicidal. I wanted to climb the Devil's Thumb, a peak only professional climbers could summit. With a very small amount of cash, I was able to arrange for a boat ride to Alaska, a plane to drop me supplies on the mountain, and the bare essentials needed for climbing. On the way up, I made several mistakes. I almost burned my whole tent down. I used up certain supplies too quickly, and I miscalculated the weather conditions. Yet, after several failed attempts and near-death situations, I made it up the mountain. My story could have ended just as easily as Chris's did. It was sheer luck that I made it home alive. So what drove me to embark on this journey? It could have been the overwhelming pride I felt in my youth, as if I was indestructible, and the world couldn't stop me. May have had to do with the trauma I felt from the fractured relationship with my dad, driving me to disregard any sense of safety and engage in risky behavior in order to find happiness. Either way, we see that Chris's actions weren't completely thoughtless, and that he had some sort of internal struggle that drove him to Alaska. Chris died in the Alaskan bush after accidentally eating poisonous berries. Had he not made this mistake, he may still be alive today. Many of his criticizers say he died a pointless death. Yet, his death was not in vain. At the start of this journey, I set out to find one thing. What drove Chris to abandon his perfect life for one of grit, suffering, and famine? From Walt and Billy, we learned that their conflict stemmed from his father's dishonesty about the birth of his children. From Ron, we learned that he wanted to take his life into his own hands and find happiness by any means necessary. From Emerson, we learned that the transcendentalists go into nature in order to discover universal truths by cutting ties with society. So, why did he leave? In some of his last writings, he highlighted a passage from the book Dr. Zhivago, which read, "And so it turned out that only a life similar to the life of those around us, merging with it without a ripple, is genuine life, and that an unshared happiness is not happiness." Above it, he wrote, "Happiness is only real when shared." Chris spent so much of his time on a solitary quest to find truth and happiness that he never realized how to find real happiness when he can share his knowledge with others. We can only assume that if Chris had made it back to society, to his family, he would have been a changed man, one who stopped running from intimacy and relationships and became a member of the human community.